good afternoon. I am José Pio Borges, chairman of CEBRI's Board of Trustees. And today we have a discussion about in our international trade group. The CEBRI's International Trade Group is led by Vice President of the Board of Trustees, Ambassador Graça Lima, and Senior Fellow Victor do Prado, Director of WTO Council and Trade Negotiations Committee. The program seeks to promote a debate about the current Brazilian foreign trade policy. And in the end, our purpose is to issue a policy paper with suggestions and measures for Brazil to have a successful trade policy. Brazil officially expressed its interest in becoming a member of the OECD in May 2017. Since then, the country has intensified cooperation with the OECD to a greater extent, converging to the organization's standards and seeking to broaden its participation in different OECD bodies. Today, we have a wonderful group of panelists to discuss Brazil's role in this in OECD, who will be properly introduced by Victor do Prado. Marion Jansen, Director of Trade and Agriculture at OECD, Andreas Chael, Director of OECD Global Relations, Carlos Braga, Professor of Dom Cabral Foundation, Carlos Cozendey, Brazil's Delegate to International Economic Organizations, including OECD, and Sarkis, José Boini Sarkis, the Secretary for Foreign Trade and International Affairs at Itamaraty. Both of them have participated several times in CEBRI's discussion. So please, Zé Alfredo, if you can start the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, José Pio. And good morning and good afternoon to the participants in this thought-provoking and timely debate regarding the OECD and Brazil, which take place against the background of this country's process of accession to an organization once dubbed as the Rich Man's Club, a sort of opponent to the UNCTAD at a time when the gap between industrialized economies and developing nations had widened considerably. CEBRI and its international trade program is fortunate, as Pio pointed out, and thanks to Victor do Prado's convening power, to bring together such Brazilian experts as Professor Carlos Primo Braga, Carlos Márcio Cozendey, and Sarkis, as well as two heads of relevant directorates at the OECD, namely Marion Jansen, Director of Trade and Agriculture, and Andreas Chael, Director of Global Relations. I am personally delighted to welcome Sarkis, who practically started his career in Brasilia as the OECD desk in the Finance Policy Division of Itamaraty and is now Secretary of Foreign Trade and Economic Affairs of the Ministry of External Relations. Carlos Márcio is an even older friend and colleague, as our relationship goes back to the mid-'80s, before our representative to the OECD pursued a long and successful journey in economic diplomacy, both in and out of the ministry. I also take pleasure in extending my greetings to Carlos Primo Braga, to whom I am forever indebted for the many lessons on international trade issues learned in the course of decades. And I am extremely pleased to make the acquaintance of Marion and Andreas, who both made themselves available to partake in our discussions today. Last but not least, I wish to thank Victor, also a dear friend and co-worker on many occasions, for acting here as moderator. I'm sure that under his able guidance, we shall all leave this event with a better understanding of what is at stake in Brazil's intent to become a full member of the OECD and the challenges ahead. It is clear to me, and I believe to a majority of economists, diplomats, and academicians, that accession to the OECD is a natural step in the efforts to have one's public policies and practices more aligned with those of the other members, the readiness to accept obligations in a number of areas being a strong indication of commitment to cooperate in order to integrate globally and develop on a sustainable basis. To my mind, Brazil's engagement in this process of accession represents a bold and suitable signal to investors and economic agents in general that we are prepared to carry on the rules, disciplines, and reforms apt to provide a strong institutional framework with a view to build confidence in the economy. Society should derive long-term benefits from such measures. It must be acknowledged, however, that a few but respectable voices in some circles find Brazil's accession to the OECD premature or not urgent or even uncalled for, calling to mind the giving up of policy space arguments so dear to decision makers even after the success of the Real Plan in 1994. I am confident that today's event will shed light on this persistent divide as well as on the obligation by Brazil to cease to apply for special and differential treatment in WTO in exchange for support to have its plea for accession to the OECD be considered in a timely manner. I thank you all, and over to you, Victor.
Thank you very much, José Alfredo. Good morning, good afternoon to all. Thank you to our President, José Pio Borges, and a big thank you to all colleagues, friends who are participating and speaking in the seminar. Really a debt of gratitude for your time and for your thoughts and for your energy in being here. I would like to start inviting Carlos Braga. You mentioned it, José Alfredo. Professor Carlos Braga is an associate professor at Dom Cabral Foundation. He's also the director of UXI Consultoria and a visiting professor at Colegio de México. He was a professor of international political economy at the IMD, famous institute here in Lausanne, and a director of the Evian Group at the IMD. Previously, he was the special representative and director for Europe External Relations at the World Bank. Carlos has a long tradition in understanding trade and economic matters, and recently published an article called Brazil and the OECD, Much Ado About Nothing, which I thought was thought-provoking. So with that, Carlos, over to you, and I would kindly request you and others to, if you could limit your presentations to 10 minutes, so we have time for all. Thank you very much. Over to you, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Victor. Good morning, good afternoon to all. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks to CEBRI for the invitation. Victor made a brief intervention about my curriculum. I would say that when I say my prayers tonight, I will have to pray for his soul, for all the lies he told about me, and for my own soul, for having enjoyed so much the lies that he told. So, my connection with OECD goes a long time, beginning in the 1990s, when I was a trade economist in the research department of the World Bank, working on topics like intellectual property rights, trade and service, regional trade agreements. And it's interesting to note that one of my research assistants was Raed Safadi, that later became the deputy director of the Trade and Agriculture Committee at OECD. In the 2000s, between 2003 and 2006, I was the senior trade advisor of the World Bank based in Geneva. and I used to represent the World Bank at OECD meetings. Lately, as pointed out by Victor, I became the special representative for the World Bank in Europe, and was based in Paris and also participated significantly in OECD committees and issues about trade and development. So this is just to say that I have a profound admiration for OECD, and I really enjoy the intellectual strength of the organization. I collaborated closely, for instance, with Pier Carlo Paduan, who was the chief economist of OECD. We published a book together, our OECD World Bank book about trade and innovation. Now, to understand what does it mean to join an organization like OECD, it's useful to have a little bit of history. The roots of OECD are deeply ingrained in the history of the Cold War, Marshall Plan, and the initial activities that led with the announcement of the Marshall Plan by the United States for the reconstruction of Europe, activities that led to the creation of the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. This is the organization, to a certain extent, that antecedes OECD. It had a very important role in the allocation of the aid for the Marshall Plan, which was not a trivial issue. Just to put some numbers, between 1948 1951, something like $11.8 billion in dollars of that time were allocated for the reconstruction of Europe by the United States. They went mainly to the UK, France, Italy, and even to West Germany. Now, over time, there was a big debate about the role of the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. There was lots of emphasis on issues of productivity. New agencies associated with OEEC were created, but at the same time, there were some moments of crisis, like, for instance, when the United States decided that maybe NATO would be a better mechanism to allocate aid for Europe. But in the end, the institutional structure prevailed, and in 1961, OEEC was superseded by OECD. So, points to emphasize: mainly European countries, plus the United States and Canada, and that was an organization that from the very beginning had as its objective to create rules for governance that would help in terms of global governance, with liberalization of trade, liberalization of capital movements, rules for foreign direct investment, and later on many other issues, like, for instance, OECD nowadays is taking the lead in discussions with respect to digital trade, environmental issues, etc. The process of enlargement of OECD started almost immediately. In 1964, Japan joined the original members. Later on, we had Finland, Australia, New Zealand, all between 1964 and 1973. Then in 1994, we had the beginning of a new era for OECD. It's also true that OECD, although, as many pointed out, was considered a club of wealthy countries, but from the very beginning, a country like Turkey, a middle-income economy, was already a member from OEEC and later OECD. This was part, of course, of the strategic role in the context of the Cold War situation that characterized that period. But in 1994, we had some major changes, with Mexico becoming the first Latin American country and also a middle-income economy, later followed by the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Korea, and the Slovak Republic. So that was a new wave of enlargement. It's interesting to note that both Mexico and Korea were members, founding members of the Group of 7-7. And as a condition for their accession to OECD, they have to relinquish their membership to the Group of 7-7. So this puts a little bit in perspective the different views of the world that characterize Western democracies, the typical characteristic of members of OECD, and developing countries that had in UNCTAD, for instance, a very important body with respect to thinking about trade, foreign direct investment, etc. Later on, there was a new phase of enlargement with Israel, Chile, Slovenia, Estonia, and more recently, of course, Latvia, Lithuania, and Colombia, that became the 37th member of OECD in 2020. And for what I understand, Costa Rica is expected to deposit its succession documents shortly to become then the 38th member, but colleagues at OECD may update me on this. All of this to say that in the case of Brazil, there is a long history of connections with OECD. Most people don't realize, but during the administration Fernando Henrique Cardoso, in the first mandate, the president indicated that Brazil had an interest in joining OECD. Later on, OECD itself, in the process of what it called the enhanced engagement, involved the so-called BRICS countries plus Indonesia as privileged partners in participation in its committees. And since 2012, these countries are characterized as key partners. Brazil has increased significantly its participation in committees. I'm sure Carlos Cozendey can update us on where we stand in this respect. But it's also true that Brazil and South Africa are probably the two key partners that have been most active in terms of their relationships with OECD over the last few years. And as you all know, in May 2007, Brazil formalized during the Temer administration its interest in joining OECD. This is still an ongoing process. And of course, how rapidly this is going to happen, it depends on many, many variables, particularly, I would argue, political variables, but also in terms of the like-mindedness of Brazilian regulations vis-a-vis the OECD acquis. It's also important to point out that in reality, in 2015, during the Dilma Rousseff administration, there was also an approach by Brazil, a cooperation agreement that is considered probably the most ambitious one among the key partners. So there is a long history there. Am I optimist? Well, there are 6 countries on the line to join OECD at this point in time: Argentina, Romania, Brazil, Peru, Croatia, and Bulgaria. Over the last few years, there have been different indications, including from Angel Gurria. We all know he's a force of nature. In 2019, for instance, he indicated that Argentina and Romania should take priority as, let's say, a mechanism to lock in liberal policies in Argentina. But of course, this didn't go very far with the election of Mr. Fernandes. So things have changed. In the case of Brazil, the alignment of the Bolsonaro administration with the Trump administration led to some important developments, with the US indicating then in 2019 support for Brazil's accession. But this was also part of a negotiation in which Brazil became, as far as I know, maybe Victor can update me on this, the only other developing country that has relinquished special and differential treatment in the WTO. So to conclude, I would say the following. When people ask me, how do I see the accession of Brazil to OECD? If people tell me to say in one word, I would say it's a good initiative. If people ask me to say in two words, I would say not good in terms of the status of the process where we stand. When we were preparing for this conversation, Marion put a very interesting question to all of us. How Brazil sees OECD? That's a very complex question, right? I would basically say that you can put, depending on who you talk to, in 5 boxes. The first box I would call the clueless. I would say 95% of the population have no clue what is OECD. And this is not a problem of Brazil. I would argue that if you go to the United States, one of the founding members, probably you get a similar, let's say, proportion. But even among those that know about OECD, that support the process, for instance, the private sector, there are those that believe that OECD is a place, for instance, to expand trade liberalization through agreements, trade agreements. Actually, I heard from an entrepreneur when Brazil began to have some problems with the EU-Mercosur agreement, that, well, it doesn't matter because we are going to join OECD. So this is the bunch that I would call the clueless.
Carlos, you have 2 minutes for all of the other 4 boxes.
Okay, I'll only need 1 minute. The second box is what I will call the old guard. Those, and here there is not necessarily any indication of age, but people who say, well, Brazil was very successful in the G77. It took a leadership among developing countries in many negotiating bodies, for instance, the G20 of the WTO, and we don't see Brazil as a member of the quote-unquote club of the wealthy. Then there is the BRICS faction that would argue, well, in reality, we should work together with the other BRICS in terms of changing OECD to a platform that is more amenable to the objectives of developing countries. Needless to say, Russia, China, I would argue, have no chance of accession to OECD in the near future. Then there is the Nike group, just do it. There are people who are doing the right work. And these are the ones that, of course, continue to push, particularly in the context of Itamaraty, the required adjustments in our legislation in order to join OECD. Needless to say, a very different story is when this goes to our parliament. Finally, there is what I would call the Stefan's Way group, Brazil, the country of the future. The idea that OECD needs us more than Brazil needs OECD. Well, it may be a nice marketing proposition, but I don't think that stands. So I'll stop here. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for this historic perspective coming all the way to the present. And we took note of your reference to Stefan Zweig, Brazil is the country of the future and will always be. I will now ask my dear friend, Ambassador Carlos Marcio Cozendey, who is Brazil's delegate to international economic organizations based in Paris, including the OECD. Ambassador Cozendey was formerly Secretary for Economic and Financial Affairs at Itamaraty, that's the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Secretary for International Affairs at the Ministry of Finance. Carlos Marcio is not going to say it, but I will, has a long history of relations with the WTO, with the GATT. That's where he started his career, and I'm sure he has good memories of the WTO and Geneva, even being in Paris. Carlos Marcio, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to thank CEBRI for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be in this panel. In fact, CEBRI has been doing a great job in promoting very high-level debates, and I'm honored to be here today. I'll try to do the more factual part of the Brazilian accession to OECD and let Sarkis later on go more into the policy aspects of that. And as it was said, Brazil requested accession to the OECD 4 years ago. We're concluding the 4th year now in this month. And the OECD has not yet decided that Brazil can start the process. But Brazil has a long-standing cooperation with the OECD. And we have been cooperating with the OECD since the 90s. And I'll show one slide. No, I'll not show one slide because the host disabled participant screen share. No. Well, so Brazil started cooperating with the OECD in the 90s, became a member of the STIL committee, was the first committee that Brazil took part in, and steadily went on with increasing its participation in OECD committees, working groups, and so on. So by now, we have a formal status in around 32, 33 committee level bodies. The OECD has less committees than that, but there are other bodies that are considered committee level. You can be, if you're not a member of the OECD, you can participate in its activities as an invitee of a committee. You can participate as a participant, that's a kind of observer, or you can participate as an associate. Now, Brazil, those 32 are those where Brazil participates either as a participant or as an associate. But in practice, we participate in all of them, given that as a key partner, we have this possibility of participating in different groups, and we are regularly invited to all the committees, and given that since 2018, we have this delegation here in Paris, we have been able at committee level to participate of all the meetings. Of course, it's not possible to do that at the level of all the working groups because there are a lot of them. But in any case, with the present situation, OECD meetings are all virtual. So that has allowed us to have a much greater participation from Brasilia, and it has helped us to better organize our participation and improve the quality of that participation as well. Mariam has seen in the trade and in the agricultural area that Brazilians are getting more active and giving more comments and examining more the studies. I think this is all part of a big effort, a general effort to increase our participation in the organization. We have also increased the number of instruments of the OECD to which we adhere. The OECD has recommendations and decisions. They are by now 245. This number changes all the time because some old ones are withdrawn and new ones are created. But by now, the OECD has 245. Brazil is part to 99 of those. Since 94, we started gradually and moved up the scale of adherence to different instruments gradually along different governments. And I think that's important to highlight. But of course, after 2017, this number increases very rapidly and reaches 99 instruments. And of course, next week, the Council will approve another instrument, and that will be our 100th instrument of the OECD. What made that possible was that when we decided to ask for accession 2017, an examination was done of all of the acquis of the OECD, and we asked different ministries and agencies how they felt that that instrument compared to Brazilian legislation on one side and to Brazilian policy on the other side. And already on the first go, we had 70% of instruments that were considered convergent. On that basis, we asked them, which are those where you feel we don't need to do anything else, that we already fulfill? And that was the basis for a number of requests that were made. So by now, 99 of those requests, 99 is the total number, when most of those requests were accepted. We have 99 instruments that we have adhered to. There are a number of others which are in examination right now. But after different rounds of examination, we think today that around 90% will not present a problem. Of course, that's our opinion. So the Secretariat and members would have to examine that during the accession process and see if they agree with us or not. Now, we also have increased the number of reviews and studies that we participate on. Right now, we have almost 20 studies and reviews going on. And that is, so the three pillars: participation in bodies, adhering to instruments, and doing studies, contribute to a preparation process that would shorten the time of the accession process once we start, because we will already know well the instruments. The OECD committees would know us, know our policies through the reviews. They would also get in contact, not only our ministries and our officials will know better what are the requirements, but also the committees will know better, in the Secretariat will know in more detail our own policies and know exactly where the difficulties are. In some areas, we have been doing exactly that, specific studies together with the Secretariat to identify and compare Brazilian legislation and policies with OECD requirements, so as to give us an idea of what still needs to be done. So in terms of preparation, we are quite well. In terms of cooperation, we cooperate a lot. So why do we need to accede to OECD? If we already participate, if we already have all those instruments adhered to? I think that there are two functions of the OECD that are key to understand that, and the difference between being a member and non-member. First one is that, of course, one of the main functions is that the OECD is a club of good practices. So in the past, it used to be known as a club of the rich. But of course, as Carlos Braga explained, there was a lot of rounds of expansion, and you have included Mexico, Korea, the Eastern European countries, Costa Rica, Colombia. So it's much more heterogeneous now. You cannot say it's really a rich man's club. It's more a club of good practice, club of where countries interchange their experiences in order to identify what are those who work best. So one first aspect of being a member is that the benchmarking of Brazilian policies in relation to the best practices would be a permanent thing. So instead of doing a specific study here, a comparison there, it would be a regular activity. All studies, all reviews of OECD would have Brazil included there, and that would allow Brazilian officials to have a permanent evaluation and comparison of their policies in relation to other policies and in terms of their results. The second aspect is that the OECD also has a role in fixing the international agenda. The OECD generates new issues, and those issues later are negotiated either in the OECD itself or in other bodies. So the Trade Committee in the OECD has very few instruments. Why? Because they discuss the issues there, then they take to the WTO, and then the negotiation happens in the WTO. So you have very few recommendations and decisions in the trade area in the OECD. Now, although then it's not a universal organization, it does have a global impact. So those instruments become international standards in practice because of the economic weight of OECD members. And Brazil participates in those discussions in the committees. We do give opinion, give suggestions, propose sentences to be included in decisions, in recommendations. But of course, if at the end Brazil wants something that other members don't want, or we don't want something that other members want, we won't have the power, although everything is decided by consensus at the OECD, we won't have the power to block any recommendation or to influence the agenda in the same way as the members do. So participation in the decision-making process is very different if you are a participant, even if you are an associate to the committee, than if you are a member and can have a full participation. Finally, if we have all that and we have that degree of participation, why the process does not start? I can say that today, although we still don't know very clearly the position of the new US administration, but we had the support of all the OECD members to Brazilian accession, but it did not start. Why? As Carlos Braga mentioned, there are 6 candidates, 3 are Europeans, 3 non-Europeans. And among members, you have a very different profile. While the European Union countries, because there are 3 candidates which are from the European Union, they would prefer that the 6 countries start at the same time the accession process, because then their 3 would start the process. On the other side, on the other corner, you have the United States that is much more cautious about enlargement of the OECD traditionally, and that sees this process as with a big focus on convergence, and therefore thinks that it should be one by one, that not necessarily other European countries should come in, not necessarily you're going to be as relevant to the organizations. So they would prefer to go it very slowly. And those differences were not, the members were not able to match those differences in the last 4 years. And because Europeans would not accept a decision that would not include and would not give a clear prospect for their members, while the US would not accept to commit to all the European countries. So right now, the process is more or less in a waiting mode, because the new US administration has not defined its position towards enlargement as a whole, and each candidate in specific terms. Last year, it was very difficult to advance because not only because of the pandemics, but also because there was a succession process going on, the selection of the new Secretary General. The new Secretary General starts 1st June. So we hope we'll have a ministerial in 2 parts, one virtual ministerial next week, and another at the end of the year that should be in presential terms. So we hope that from now, with the new Secretary General coming in, so all those issues related to choosing the new Secretary General and so on are in the past. The new Secretary General will be able to dedicate some of his time, an important part of his time, to this issue, because I think he recognizes that this is a key issue for the organization, and he won't be able to move ahead, for instance, with his idea to open the organization more to the Asian countries if he doesn't solve this. So he will have to solve this. And so we expect that by October or November, depending on when the next part of the ministerial, which should be presential, takes part. We hope that by that point, members will be in a position to have a decision on the starting of the process. In any case, for Brazil, the process in itself is important, and the process of preparation in itself is important. So I've heard with great interest the characterization that Carlos Braga made of how different Brazilians position themselves in relation to the OECD. I would say that today, because in practice we have been moving forward, the positive view is getting more and more and is generally accepted. I would say that, I don't know, Sarkis will have to say that, but I think that probably it's, in terms of foreign policy today, is one of the most consensual issues in Brazil. And the experience of the officials that participate has been generally very positive. So, of course, there are those more political discussions that could take place, but in practice, their participation in the committees and their participation in the studies, in the reviews, has been very positive and felt as a very important contribution. So independent of what happens with accession, I think Brazil will continue to cooperate with the OECD in the future. Now, of course, it's quite frustrating and to be in the waiting line for such a long time, and members will have to decide what they want to do with our campus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos Marcio. We had a few weeks ago a meeting of the curators of CEBRI, and one senior ambassador mentioned the OECD issue and said, Brazil has been knocking at the door of the OECD. We cannot be left out in the cold, he said, in the sereno, in the drizzle forever. At some point in time, people need to make up their mind. Will they let us in, yes or no? So to answer that, let me ask Andreas Schall to take the floor. Andreas is the director of OECD Global Relations. In this function, he leads and coordinates on ministerial level the external policy and relations of the OECD with over 100 partner countries around the globe, aiming to make the OECD standards and policies count on a global scale and thus contributing to a global level playing field. Andreas, thank you very much for being here, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Victor. Great pleasure. And believe me, if it was up to me only, we would already sit there with Brazil and having dinner or having a dessert or having at least caipirinhas. But this is the ultimate decision of our members. And there are always different parts of the equation, as Carlos has explained. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. It's with so many friends, it almost feels like a family reunion, I have to say, seeing Carlos Cosende, with whom I work quite intensively here as a co-chair of the Latin America program, but also for when he was G20 Sherpa, and when we set up the first program of work with Brazil. And Sarkis is also a very good colleague who was in Paris in the OECD delegation, and whom last time I think we met in Shanghai in your former incarnation. So it's such a pleasure to be here. And Carlos Braga, of course, one of the big brains who has always influenced also our thinking. And this brings me to my major point in the introduction. Thanks to CEBRI and the colleagues for bringing us together, because this gives us the opportunity to also showcase that we have been in a process of fundamental transformation in the OECD for several years. Meaning that not only Brazil has changed, but the OECD has changed quite a lot. And let me mention 4 avenues. First, we are now working, and Carlos referred to it, we have many emerging economies, developing countries as members. We are working with my team is working with more than 100 developing countries. So when Chile decided to join, Michelle Bachelet, the then president of Chile, said, this is not about joining the club of the rich, but it's about joining the club of best practices. So the OECD has transformed more as a club for policies, for international standards setting. Then in the last 15 years, and this is thanks also to Piercarlo Padua, Carlos Braga, and others, we have changed the growth model from one which was maybe based only on the Washington consensus at one moment in time in the 80s, to one which looks at different dimensions. Strong, of course, productivity, of course, open markets and trade, of course, but also which is a growth model which looks at the inclusiveness aspects, at the green aspects, as the sustainable aspects. And third avenue, which I want to leave with you, and this is also something Carlos Cosende has mentioned, the OECD does not aim to become a universal organization like the UN, but we have the ambition that our standards and policies have an impact and count on a global scale. And this is basically the strategy which led the organization since the early 2000 to build bridges with key emerging markets, assigning Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, South Africa as key partners to better integrate also the prospects of emerging economies into the work of the OECD. Not only to lecture or to kind of bring them to a standard model in the OECD, which was written in stone, but really to develop best practices together, to have a policy dialogue and to see what we can do together to shape globalization. And this is a deep undergoing transformation in the organization. This has been accelerated also by the participation of the OECD in the G20. I mean, the taxation agenda, the anti-corruption agenda, the agenda for the gender agenda, for example, employment use agenda. This is heavily influenced by the OECD. And these are not topics coming where the advanced economies kind of push their views and their interests through the world and force emerging economies, developing countries to sign somewhere. So this is the transformation the OECD is in. Also a transformation in regional accounts. I mean, 20 years ago, we had only Mexico as a member in Latin America, which joined in 1994, if I'm not mistaken. Now, over the last decade, Chile joined in 2010, Colombia in 2020, and Costa Rica, and I'm glad that Carlos Braga mentioned this. As we speak, today at 4 o'clock, Costa Rica deposits its instrument for accession to the OECD, the final step. Tomorrow there will be a council meeting, and tomorrow there will be a press release that Costa Rica is the 38th member of the OECD. And you can also see, I mean, Carlos Cosende is a co-chair in Brazil, is a co-chair in our Latin America, Caribbean regional program. We have now membership requests from Brazil, from Argentina, from Peru. So there is not only in Brazil this notion that it's maybe a good thing to move as Latin American country closer to the OECD, but it's a broader development over the past decade. In this context, I have to say, when we compare the countries, so Brazil is by far the country that has made most of this partnership. The OECD and Brazil are bound by solid and long-standing cooperation that dates back to the early 90s when Brazil joined the Steel Committee, the OECD Development Center. And then we with Carlos Cosende, and this was already under the government of Dilma Rousseff. We started to work on the first OECD Brazil work program, and I was pretty amazed to see after 24 months, Carlos and the team already accomplished 95% of all the agreed work we said in terms of instruments, in terms of committees. So very thorough assessment, which we have not seen in any other countries. That's why, as Carlos mentioned, today Brazil adheres to 1/3 of all OECD acquis. It is the first country from the key partners who has decided to apply for membership. But we are also hearing some signals from the Widodo government in Indonesia that they are considering seriously. They are doing gap studies, feasibility studies, whether this is something which they could consider in the near future. So from our point of view, the moving closer of Brazil to the OECD, the membership request was more a natural process in the context of complex policy choices. Let me give you a few examples where we see potential or where we're currently working on. Part of the adherence process is the adherence to the OECD codes of liberalization. Brazil implemented there a remarkable set of measures, greatly leveled the playing field for foreign investors. So this is widely recognized by our partners, and this is also something which is kind of part of the reform agenda. It was part of the reform agenda already in the Temer government, and it's also now part in the reform agenda of the current administration. And I dare to say there is nothing left or right with this kind of policies to make the capital markets more efficient in this sense. Impressive progress, and this was always a sensitive issue, was achieved on tax policy. We have been embarking with Receita Federal on a project on transfer pricing. This gained even more important in the current crisis. Positive outcomes may play an important role in helping the government to raise additional tax revenues by preventing what we call at the OECD base erosion and profit shifting, the fact that multinational just kind of try to move their profits elsewhere and at the end pay no taxes, neither in the country where the profits are generated nor where the profits are moved to. So this is a project where we believe Brazil has made good progress to align itself with international standards, also in their own interest of revenue raising. And this was an issue which was always sensitive in our discussions with Fazenda, because there was always the fear or the question whether Brazil would lose tax revenues when moving to a more internationally aligned transfer pricing system, which we could, I hope, at least, and I think what I see up to now, which we could dispel in looking closer into the detail. As we speak, we are conducting at the OECD a number of projects on a wide range of issues, including environment, climate change, education, regulatory policy, competition, investment, trade, transparency, public governance, also the different levels of government, which is quite important for a federal state like Brazil, and health. And we believe that also this pandemic, as bad as it is, it gives us some interesting hacks, some interesting feature to work together to see what we can do in terms of the rebuilding back better, how the OECD can help to really reform some of Brazil's economic policies, how to bring the people on board, how to invest in their skills, how to invest in a digital economy, how to make the central level better work together with the local level, and things like that. So these are things where I think, and like Carlos, we can work together no matter of if and when the membership question comes into play, but we can work together to support whatever government is in place to kind of bring Brazil further forward. And we also benefit, and this is also in response to Carlos Braga, we also benefit from the very specific experiences of Brazil as the 8th largest economy in the world, which has something to say, for example, when it comes to the use of renewables, when it comes to the use of biofuels. I mean, there's a huge also interest in our members in tackling the challenges around climate change with innovative models of economic policies. So this is, I think, where I would leave it.
Andreas, yeah, thanks a lot. But please go ahead. I thought that you were going to go on, but you were concluding, right?
No, I was. I think this is where I was thinking whether I could say more on your introductory question, but I think I would just leave it there. That there's a lot to do. What we can do to raise productivity, promote competition, reduce tax complexity, promote inclusion of the people, invest in the skills of the people. That's what the OECD is about, and that's what we are excited about the cooperation with Brazil. And I believe, like Carlos, sooner or later there will be no. Brazil belongs into the OECD, and I think sooner or later there will be a decision. The question is just when and with what kind of sequencing, because there are other candidates in the boat, and we just need to see which boat leaves the harbor first, and we will take it from there. Thank you very much indeed. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting, Andreas. I surely learned a lot. Since you mentioned Costa Rica, and congratulations to the OECD for that, I just wanted to quickly reply to a question that Carlos Braga had put. You know, the way I understood that the issue of developing country in the WTO is not that Brazil relinquished its status as developing country in the WTO. What I heard Brazil saying, and my Brazilian colleagues may confirm this, is that Brazil would no longer claim special and differential treatment, which is different than relinquishing developing country status, would no longer claim special and differential treatment in current and future negotiations. So this is quite specific. And by the way, other countries have done it, notably Costa Rica, that Andreas mentioned. But not only, Korea has done it, Singapore, and Chinese Taipei. So Brazil is not alone in this. I just wanted to tell colleagues we have some interesting questions. I was just browsing through the questions, and we have some important people watching. I just noticed that our dear friend Fernando de Mateo in Mexico is watching us. So a good greeting to Fernando. And now over to Marion Jansen. Marion is the Director of Trade and Agriculture at the OECD. Marion previously held senior positions at the WTO, at the International Labor Office, the ILO, and at the International Trade Center. And in these roles, she has provided support to trade negotiations and to WTO dispute settlement. Marion was the chief economist at the ITC before joining the OECD. We can just say that we miss her here in Geneva, but I'm sure she's doing a great job at the OECD. Marion, over to you.
Thank you, Victor. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. I will add to the OECD voice in this meeting, to Andreas's voice, but I will focus on a trade and agriculture point of view, because that's the area of work I'm focusing on at the OECD. And I will try to convince Carlos all the 5 boxes, the people in each of the 5 boxes that you mentioned, of the fact that it would be interesting for the Brazil to become a member of the OECD. One obvious reason for this is that you speak about 5 boxes. We work in my directorate along 5 pillars. I don't think that it's one pillar for each box, but at least we already have the numbers matching. And in my arguments, I will finish by coming back to Stefan Zweig. One other reason why we would be a good match is if Brazil is the land of the future. I would like to argue that the OECD is the organization for the future, at least in the area I'm working in. So let me explain a bit what we are doing, explain this along these 5 pillars that I mentioned. And when doing this, also try to explain why why being part of these discussions is important, useful in my view for a content, why it makes a difference whether you are a member or not. One reason why I think it is important to be part of the discussions is that we have at the OECD a quite unique way of working. In my directorate, we like to position ourselves as a trusted partner for change. Trusted because we are known for the high quality of the evidence we generate. Partner because we don't just generate evidence and throw it at members' face. No, we actually discuss that evidence and we only publish what our members have agreed to be published. Now, that leads to difficulties, but it has the huge advantage that our evidence is close to the policymaker and therefore close to implementation. We are not working in an ivory tower, even though we are working at the highest level of quality in our research. Trusted partner for change because we would want to be at the forefront of our analysis and be able to help our members in a changing environment, and a changing environment that is what we are currently facing. I don't know how it's for the people in this group, but I currently wouldn't dare to say whether the future of trade is transatlantic, transpacific, or takes place via belts and roads. There are important changes taking place, and we want to help our members to be a proactive part in these changes. Now, let me come to these 5 pillars then. One of these pillars, we titled it work on anticipation and managing change. So that is work where we look at forecasting, we look at data, what is going on, how can we help our members to understand evolution in markets and to better position. One example for this is our agricultural outlook that we publish with the FAO. It's going to be published, the 2020 edition, on July 5th. Brazil is covered in this work, and this is work that is used by many agricultural ministries across the globe for their own assessments of agricultural production and trade in the future. It's used as a baseline by them. So it's really a benchmark, as Ambassador Cosende mentioned, for work on agricultural trade. So forecasting and managing change. The second pillar is global value chains. And here also the issue of benchmarking is important. We work in that area, for instance, on trade facilitation indicators. Now, Victor works for an organization that takes care of the trade facilitation agreement. Now, our indicators are not a monitoring mechanism for that agreement, but they help you to understand where you are on trade facilitation vis-a-vis commitments in the WTO. We measure the same things, and Brazil is covered, of course, in this Trade Facilitation Index. We also have a role in standard setting, notably in the area of tractors, fruits and vegetables, seeds and forestry, and Brazil is already a member of numerous of these standard schemes. And standards matters, we know, for global value chains because they make trade within the chain so easy. And those of you who don't really see this, but also, Carlos, I've been told that you find TBT and SPS boring. Now, look at what happens if you don't stick to the same rules anymore. That's what we are currently seeing with the Brexit. And I don't know what your sense is in Brazil, but what we are seeing between the UK and the EU borders looks quite dramatic to me. So standards may be boring thing to set. May not be interesting when they exist and when they are abided to, but when they fall away, we see how much of a cost they generate. First pillar, anticipating and managing change. Global value chain, second pillar. Third pillar, then benefits from innovation and new technologies. And there we are working with Brazil on a digital trade review. So very much looking at the aspects of new types of trade, of digital trade. Again, a signal that we want to be on the forefront of new types of trade, but also in agriculture, we are looking at digital certification of standards and norms and the use of digital tools in order to optimize production in agriculture. Now, let me come to pillar 4 and 5. Pillar 4 is the one we call interlinkages among policies. I find that looks a bit sounds a bit boring. I prefer to call it complex systems. But what we are doing there is basically to look at the economic, social, and environmental effects of policies at the same time. This, I think, is a very interesting, thrilling area of work. It's an area of work that when I started my career 25 years ago was on the margins of research and of discussions. Trade was trade, environment was environment, labor markets were labor markets. And there were only a few people who look at those things at the same time. Nowadays, policymakers are expected to look at all these things at the same time. And this is increasingly happening. In this area, we are notably working on trade and gender. We are working on food systems, trying to understand how food systems can both give incomes to farmers, provide food to people, but also be produced in a way that is environmentally sustainable. And very hot issue, we are discussing border carbon adjustment measures in our committee. Now, this is an example of a discussion that Brazil cannot attend as a member of the OECD, because those discussions, our members consider them so sensitive that they take place in a confidential session, so among only members and even under Chatham House rules. But what the OECD does is to provide a platform, a possibility for members to exchange views on an issue that I can tell you is tricky among our members and on which there's not necessarily agreement. Not only are members discussing that matter in the Trade Committee, they are also discussing it in the Environment Committee. They will also be discussing it in the directorate that is dealing with taxes, because border carbon adjustment, dealing with carbon emissions and trade is something that cuts across ministries. And one of the advantages of the OECD is that representatives of all these ministries can meet with their counterparts from the member countries and discuss these tricky issues. Now, I've mentioned 4 of the 5 pillars. Let me come to the last one, transparency and level playing field. We publish numerous sets of data, and Brazil is part of those data sets most of the time. And many of these data sets help us to benchmark, but also to facilitate level of a playing field. Think of producer support measures in agriculture. We are, by the way, publishing the next report in June, where we look at how are governments spending money on agriculture and to which extent is this distortive, maybe distorting trade, or to which extent is this good in order to make agriculture more environmentally friendly? We do the same thing for fisheries. Also there, Brazil is covered by the data, and we are currently looking into how our countries supporting industrial sectors, and maybe in a way that is distorting the level playing field. This is a topic that is very relevant for the discussions at the WTO on WTO reform, to which extent are state-owned enterprises, for instance, distorting trade, and to which extent are our members concerned about this. The work there is very related to some of the work we are doing under our export credit arrangements, and there Brazil has been a member for some time of the sectorial arrangement on aircraft. And this is also a setting where we agree on what are you allowed to do when you give an export credit, what are you not allowed to do if you do not want to distort competition in a way that upsets other members. So I believe that with these 5 pillars, we are working in areas that are not only forward-looking, like new technologies, digital, or forecasting of change, very high on the agenda, like global value chains and their resilience, but also complex, both geostrategically, think of level playing field, and for comprehensive policy making, think of all these issues where we look at complex policy linkages. With this combination of areas we work on, I do think we are an agency, an organization that is there to help you in the future. And therefore, I repeat what I said at the beginning: if you're the land of the future, then we are a very good fit. Thank you.
That's a very nice way to finish. Thank you very much, Marion. Really, really appreciate it. Before I pass the floor to Ambassador Sarkis, let me just ask the participants. There are a few interesting questions that are being asked by participants. I've noticed that Carlos Cozendey is already replying to some of them. There are a few others that you might wish to take a look. And since we are fast advancing on time, you may wish to perhaps provide one reply or two in writing, as Ambassador Cozendey has done. But with that, let me pass to Ambassador Sarkis, José Bonin Sarkis, who is currently the Secretary for Foreign Trade and Economic Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil. Ambassador Sarkis has served in Brazilian embassies in London, Berlin, where we were colleagues in another incarnation, Paris and Tokyo. He also had a stint at the BRICS Development Bank in Shanghai. So, and has a long history with the OECD, as Ambassador Graça Lima mentioned in the beginning of this webinar. Sarkis, my friend, over to you.
Thank you, Vitor. Thank you, CEBRI, José Pio Borges and Vitor, for inviting me, inviting Itamaraty to be part in this panel. It's great to see friends from the OECD, friends for a long period, Andreas, Marion, and many other. It's also great to see my colleagues from Itamaraty, José Alfredo, a former boss, who influenced me a lot at the beginning of my career, when I was willing to work almost only in economic diplomacy, and eventually I think I most did it. Carlos Cozendey, an old friend and colleague, and Vitor, a former colleague. And it's great to see Carlos Primo Braga, whom I knew before I met him in Paris in one of these trade committee sessions, working groups, and so on and so forth. Well, the topic is a big one. And to start, I would just say that I fully agree with Marion. It's not only a good fit, it's almost a perfect fit for the 21st century, Brazil and the OECD. Trends and perspectives. I would try to focus on very macro, long-term trends and perspectives. I think they are more interesting, both for the OECD and for Brazil. The relationship has been a long one. Actually, I like to say it started in June 1991, when a predecessor of mine and of Cosendei and of Graça Lima, Ambassador Clodoaldo Huguenet, led a delegation of the Brazilian government to the headquarters in Paris. This was June 91, and Brazil was interested in knowing more about the OECD, and there we agreed a process of mutual collaboration, knowledge, approximation, and trying to identify lines of work in which there was some basis for common understanding and progress. And eventually, this gradual relationship expanded, and Carlos Braga, Cosendei, and Andreas, they did well reporting what eventually happened. Brazil has changed, the OECD has changed, and there is a lot still to do. I would say this history of Brazil-OECD relationship will mark 21st century a lot. It will mark the building of economic cooperation and development in this century. And why? Because Brazil is going to add huge value to the OECD after the OECD has changed a lot. And also OECD can be very instrumental for Brazil, a country that remains a laboratory for development. The OECD is unique in many ways. It's not a rules-based organization like the WTO. It's not an organization that has resources like the IMF or the Multilateral and Regional Development Bank. The OECD has an analytical capacity, and I think it has a unique analytical capacity and developed its own methods in this regard. It's mainly an empirical evidence organization. It's not a rich man club. It's not only a public policy club. It's more than that. It's one that wants to get reality picture by data and reality understood by empirical evidence. This is the commitment of the OECD. That's why Secretary General has the capacity to publish reports, data, international comparisons, and so on and so forth. Of course, joint with this analytical and evidence-based commitment, the OECD developed a consensus-based approach, which is characterized by peer process, peer review, on the basis of country studies, of international comparisons, and so on and so forth. I would say, despite the threat of the 90s of the Washington Consensus, the OECD managed to remain loyal to its basic principles of generating evidence-based research, applied research, and with that, informing countries on how to proceed in terms of peer review, peer processes. Of course, the 90s were kind of different, but we overcome the 90s. The tendency to propose one size fits all to different countries. And the OECD was in many ways a resilient organization in that sense, despite all the threats. And there is where we find the strengths of the organization. And we will need them at the G20, in the international collaboration between economic organizations. The transformations are huge with emerging China, emerging India, and all other emerging economies in Asia and other parts of the world. The organization, OECD, is seeing its share of GDP declining. It has to respond to that. And it's going to respond, I would say, to Secretary General Gurria, not necessarily because of it becoming a do tank, but because it still is a think tank. The methods of the organization, and allow me to emphasize that, as I said, are based on empirical evidence, international comparison, no one size fits all, not only in terms of policy, but also in terms of analysis. Those who work with empirical analysis, they know how tricky conclusions are to be drawn and policy recommendations to be suggested. The organization has developed its methods also in the sense that it wishes to be accountable. Those who work with empirical evidence, they are always willing to see their conclusions being subject to discussions, to new findings, to controversies. And I think this is also a strength of the organization. Over the 2000s, especially with the crisis, the organization dedicated itself to crucial topics that are still fundamental to the understanding of the transformations of the 21st century. The disconnect between macro and finance, the fact that trade is undergoing a crisis since the 2008 financial crisis. We have seen trade growth declining to rates that are lower than global GDP rates of growth. This is a new fact of the 2000s. This is a new fact in the 21st century. Not by coincidence, the WTO has found itself in a crisis. It needs to be revitalized. It needs to be strengthened. And member countries have had many difficulties in revitalizing the organization. The Doha round was an illustration of that. We do expect the ministerial, the 12 ministers will be a successful one, but still those who are participating in the discussions, in the negotiations, they know we have to work with a sense of urgency, but we know the uncertainties are still huge. Collectively, international organizations and member states, we are those responsible for redesigning, reshaping the international economic governance. There is a huge criticism towards globalization and the benefits of globalization. Growth and inequality, a fundamental topic to which the OECD has dedicated a lot of its time in the 2000s. This will remain there. The challenges for countries like Brazil, who were found in this middle income trap, how do they sequence their structural reforms? Which are the lessons from the Asian countries, and so on and so forth. So the organization will keep, I believe, internalizing this evidence from the outside of the OECD. And Brazil is a huge, fantastic laboratory for that. It started as a like-mindedness organization. It became more open-minded. It found open-mindedness among member countries, among European countries. The way you have to sequence, the way you have to approach the codes of liberalization, and so on and so forth. I think the OECD has to go on mixing both like-mindedness and open-mindedness in many ways. It has to remain evidence-based to progress in that sense. It has to resist to ideological or simplified proposition. I think a part of the organization managed to do so in the 90s. And this is why OECD emerged as a strong organization in the 2000s. To me, this is what interests most to Brazil, is the kind of transparency, the kind of evidence-based approach and the accountability to public policies that the OECD managed to structure from within. And Brazil will benefit in designing better policies for better lives. The international economic governance will benefit from that in finding ways to promote trade as an instrument for growth, for inclusion, for the environment. As we are mainly discussing, as I understood from José Pio Borges, topics that can inform CEBRI and us all on proposing trade policy suggestions for Brazil and other countries, I would highlight the work of the organization in trade that interests Brazil a lot. For instance, agriculture subsidies, domestic support. The organization has done a lot in that. If I'm not wrong, Marion, for many decades. And we need to better use this data and the analysis. I think there is still work to be done in this area, which relates to the environment, the benefits of comparative advantage, the benefit of reducing agricultural subsidies to the environment, to reducing emissions globally, how efficiency and sustainability, they are part of the same equation in what agricultural trade refers to. Another area I think Marion mentioned, which is global value chain and the trading value added data set the OECD promoted with the WTO and other organizations. This is essential to better understand the challenges of trade in the 21st century. Marion also mentioned trade facilitation. I would also mention the work on services, the trade restrictiveness index on services. These are fundamental contributions, evidence-based, of the OECD.
Thanks, Sarkis. Are you done?
I almost done, Vitor.
All right. Thank you very much.
Just to conclude, Brazil and the OECD can be partners in this 21st century. Eventually, Brazil will become a member, and we will benefit a lot from that relationship. Thank you very much.
Sarkis, thank you very much indeed. I didn't mean to interrupt you, and thanks for many thought-provoking questions you put. I particularly took note of being like-minded and open-minded and resist ideological trends that might be there, and the need to keep things in a evidence-based approach. We have only 3 minutes, and I have loads of questions here from participants. There are questions about artificial intelligence. There are questions about the Amazon and the OECD, questions about China and the OECD. There's 2 interesting questions from Ambassador Renato Marques, another good friend who's participating and watching us. One dealing with whether there's any clause against authoritarian behavior by countries in the OECD, knowing that authoritarian governments tend to have their own ideas about economic policies and practices. Another question has to do with the consensus rule. If you're taking decisions by consensus, aren't you afraid that if you enlarge the membership of the OECD too much, then you risk submitting the OECD to paralysis? I'm not going to make any comparisons to any other international organizations that also take decisions by consensus. We have basically 2-3 minutes if any one of you wishes to reply to any of these questions or make any final comments. So over to you. I am, of course, particularly interested in the issue of decision-making by consensus. So this is not an issue. Andreas, maybe you can say a word about that.
I mean, for me personally, it would not be a major issue, but I will not hide in front of you that this is certainly an issue for many of our members. And it's clear, if a country like Brazil with a heavyweight joins the organization with a strong voice, this is also something our members look very carefully at. But at the same time, there is also an opportunity to reform decision-making in the OECD, to look at governance mechanisms. So we, on the side of the Secretariat, we see this as an opportunity. But I would not say it's a non-issue. But as I said at the beginning, you know, we never aimed at having a universal coverage. We will never end up with 50, 60 members. We may end up with something around 45 at one moment in time. But I guess this is about it. So whenever we speak about the optimal size of an organization, this would be, we need to have members in each of the growing regions in the world. So now we would have with Brazil, Argentina, Peru, we would maybe be done in Latin America. We have a blank spot in Southeast Asia, which is now a priority for the new Secretary General. And we have a blank spot in Africa. So this will be the things which we will be attacking strategically in the years to come.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I'm aware of the time. It's 12:30 in Brazil. It's 5:30 in Europe. Let me offer the floor to José Alfredo or José Pio Borges if you want to say any concluding words.
Graça, please.
Well, thank you so much. I'm extremely happy with what I heard and the convergence of views, both from the actors in Brazil and the directors, Marion and Andreas. I'm all for the future. And I do believe that we are in the right direction, both the OECD and Brazil. I think there's a mutually supportive, if you wish, interest in this association. And I want to congratulate my good friend José Pio for the initiative in which we have embarked, and Victor for his splendid work as a moderator, and all the participants. Very delighted to have been to participate in this event. Thank you all.
Well, thank you very much. I just would like to thank Marion, Carlos Braga, Cosende, Andreas, Sarkis, Vic, and above all, Victor and Graça, Victor, for moderating so brilliantly. I think it was a wonderful discussion. It will help us a lot. And also thank all the participants and apologize for not being able to answer such good questions that were submitted. So thank you, all of you. See you next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Such a pleasure. Bye.
Keep safe.
Abraço.
Keep safe. Yeah.
Ciao.